Chapter 28. No air. There was no air. She couldn't breathe properly. Becky was on the edge of total panic. How long had she been here, wherever here was? The last thing she could remember was talking to Elliot's mother. She was standing next to her car, just about to try Elliot's number and feeling silly, because that was the first thing she should have done. A stabbing pain in her arm, then nothing. How could she have been so stupid? She was a highly trained detective, not just some plank off the street. Tears welled up in her eyes. Was this it? Was this where she was going to die? No, she had to snap out of this. People would be looking for her. They'd know she was missing. Hope. That was what she needed right now. Becky knew that when one of their own was in danger, the police found a way. It wasn't always strictly legal, but when a fellow officer was at risk, rules were bent and lines were crossed. If they didn't find her, it wouldn't be because they hadn't tried everything they could. Just as Becky felt a sliver of positivity creeping into her addled brain, she was jarred back into reality. A crack like thunder drove her back to the edge of terror as the lid of the container was ripped open and light flooded her world. "Any leads?" Wen asked Cassie as they walked towards Damien Anderson's house. "No, Ma'am. We've done a door-to-door, and all we're getting is quiet type, kept to himself, pleasant enough, polite. You get the picture." Wen nodded. As they reached the front door, they were handed white paper suits, gloves, and overshoes. Wen sighed, as if she had time to mess about with all this. But she knew that if they ever got this bastard to court, they had to follow protocol and do things by the book. She nodded to Norman as they stepped carefully out of the way of the Socko team, who seemed to fill this small house beyond its natural capacity. "Have you found any clues to where Becky might be?" He shook his head. "Not so far, Ma'am. But this guy's off his trolley. Lots of notes and drawings of scenes for a film or a book." "A book?" said Wen. "Where are they? I want to see them." "In here." Norman led the way into the front room, where Cassie had searched. On the coffee table sat a folder. "Where was that?" said Cassie, frowning. "I looked in here, and I didn't find anything." Norman pointed to the corner of the room, where some floorboards had been lifted. "Don't worry, Sarge, we don't expect you to take the place apart. That's our job." Cassie felt relief flood over her. If anything had happened to her colleague because she'd missed something obvious, she would never have forgiven herself. Wen picked up the file, sat on the edge of a tatty armchair and flicked through the pages. There were pencil drawings of places and sketches of bodies hung up like slaughtered animals. Then she turned over the next page. Oh, fuck. Wen was looking at a very good likeness of her detective constable, tied to a post, covered in wounds, and the face fixed in what looked like a scream. But it wasn't Becky. The drawing showed Richard. Becky had been dragged out of the box by her hair. Now she sat tied to a chair, the tape ripped from her mouth, facing an even more terrifying scenario than before. "Dear God," she cried, "why are you doing this?" She looked at her kidnapper, but with the bright lights behind his head, she could only make out his silhouette. In front of her, tied by his hands to a metal ring, high on a stone column, was Richard. He was unconscious, probably drugged as she had been, though she couldn't think how this man had overpowered her partner. Richard was big and muscular, as she was small and bird-like. "How are you feeling, Detective Constable Wainwright?" the man asked. Becky struggled, but couldn't move an inch. "Not too good, I suspect. Got a headache? Feel a bit sick? It does that to you, ketamine. One quick jab, and it works. Now Richard here needed a hefty wallop on the back of his head. I think I might have hit him a bit too hard, because he's been like this for hours," he laughed. "It was hard work getting him up there without my little helper. It took a lot out of me. Worth it, though. I know. Let's see if he responds to pain." Without another word, the man went up to Richard's inert body, and Becky saw the flash of a thin metal blade. The captor put the blade against Richard's chest and pressed it lightly. Becky screamed as bright red blood oozed from the wound, and Richard cried out in agony. That's a good sign. They test brain-dead patients with pain to see if they have any reaction. Did you know that? They drop icy water into their ears. But this is much more fun. Don't you think? Much more colourful. He made another incision, this time on Richard's underarm, and it was then that Becky realised Richard was naked. The team sat hard at work, each with several pages from the file. All wore gloves and searched each piece of artwork, each page of writing, to see if it gave any clues to where their colleagues might be. Jake had managed to get into Damien's computer, but it hadn't been easy. Someone who posts on the dark web will protect their files. I can't get into some parts. That'll take longer. But what I have managed to see are his emails. Lots of dialogue with literary agents. They turn him down, he gets angry, and so on. This guy doesn't take rejection well. Writes under a different name when he deals with literary agents. Dante Black. "Mom," called Colin across the room. "There's a reference here to a cellar where he takes his victims." Cassie and the DI were at his shoulder before he had finished speaking. Wen took the sheet from Colin and inspected it. "Now we need to find out where this cellar is." "Just a mo." Cassie took out her pocketbook. "That's it. One of his neighbours said he worked at a coffee shop, but she didn't know which." Wen rubbed her eyes. "That isn't much help. Anyway, do coffee shops have cellars?" "Well, some will," Cassie shot back. "Just like some houses have cellars." "Right. Listen up, everyone. We're now looking for the name of a coffee shop. Look through it all again and see if you can link any of the dialogue with a possible name. Tell me about any places that might be worth investigating further." Richard was drifting in and out of consciousness now. Each time he was cut, he seemed to come further out of his state of oblivion. And with the pain, that wasn't necessarily good. "Why are you doing this to us?" sobbed Becky. She didn't know how much more she could take, and it felt like this was just the beginning. "Because I can." Richard's persecutor sat down in the shadows. "Because they didn't believe it could be done. They said it was too far-fetched. Not realistic enough, not believable. More horror than crime, they said. And what do they know? And now I've shown them it was possible after all. My little friend Martin and I showed them, but it was mostly me. They didn't understand you, did they? Becky tried to reach out to this deluded wretch. No, and now they'll be sorry they didn't sign me. Well, you're obviously talented. He stood up and came over to Becky, his face just a few inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her skin. Very clever, Becky, very clever. Get on his side. Make him connect with you. You're very good. But I'm sorry that won't work. As he went back to Richard, Becky struggled with the thought. She knew that face. But from where? I think we might up the ante now. What do you think, Becky? He took hold of Richard's testicles and twisted them hard. Richard screamed in agony. Good. Now then, Richard, let's see if you've got real balls. Wen had shared the full story with her team now. Everyone knew that time was running out, that they needed to act, and act fast. Nothing so far, Cassie said. She was beginning to feel defeated. They were getting nowhere, and it was now almost 3 a.m. If the story played out, they had about an hour before Becky and Richard would be killed. She felt sick. Her head hurt from lack of sleep and reading so much. She glanced at the page she'd just been looking at. Something felt relevant. But what and why? Cassie read it again, slowly, quietly. If they want to find me, they will have to work 24/7. She blinked. That was it. Mom, I think I know where Damien works. Wen crossed the incident room to her sergeant. Where? Didn't David Lowry say he went into a coffee shop in Stockton Heath called 24/7? I think so. Why? Cassie pointed to the sentence she had just read. Good girl, Cassie. Get the manager on the phone and find out if the shop has a cellar. If it does, tell him to meet us there. Dante, said Becky. You're Dante from the coffee shop. He walked slowly towards her, smiling. At last. I didn't think you were going to remember. Not that that matters now. He checked his watch. I'm disappointed with your colleagues, I must say. I really did think they would reach you before I killed you both. I left them plenty of clues, but they just weren't clever enough. Sad. Becky looked at Richard's bleeding body. He was on a slightly higher level than she was, and his blood dripped down the steps like bright red tears. When Dante had made those last 2 cuts, Richard had howled like a wounded dog, and now he was bleeding out. Blood streamed down his leg. Originally, it was spurting, but now it had reduced to a constant, steady flow. Dante had spots of blood on his face and hands, but he didn't seem to mind at all. He walked behind Becky. It's awful seeing someone you care about in pain, isn't it? He murmured into her ear. But not being able to do anything about it, that's worse. Don't you think? He slid his hands around her throat and very gently ran them up and down her neck. Becky choked back a sob. Was he about to start on her? Do you know how long it takes to bleed to death from Just a nick in the groin. No? I would have thought you'd know this, Becky. Come on, think. Becky wanted to tell him to go fuck himself, but she knew that as long as she could keep him engaged in conversation, she might stay alive. Not long, I would have thought. That's not an answer. I want you to tell me exactly how long it will take for a man like Richard to exsanguinate. Minutes? Hours? Not days. Well, it depends on so many different things, Becky managed to say. Good. Now we're getting somewhere. Expand that thesis. Age, health, fitness. Excellent. And Richard is young, healthy, and fit. He walked around to face her again. Do you think he's fit? He looks after himself. Yes. Yes, but do you think he's fit? Do you fancy him? He glanced at Richard's bleeding, battered body. Well, not so much now. When you worked together, I mean. I could have. Did you? No, he's a colleague. We just work together. But you're going to share something very special. Something not many people ever get to do. What? You're going to die together, and that's a privilege. As I revolved with the eternal twins, from hills to river outlets, the threshing floor that makes us so ferocious. What? Beautiful, isn't it? From the Divine Comedy, Dante, like me, a poet and a writer who suffered for his art. I identify with him. I feel his pain. That's why I changed my name to his. We are one spirit. Becky could see that this man was in a world of his own making, a terrible world full of pain and hurt. Suddenly he turned back to her. Now the other couple, I did them the other way around. He had to watch his lovely wife suffer. That drove him mad with grief. So when I killed him, it was a mercy, really. What now? Becky didn't want the answer she most feared. Now we wait for Richard to breathe his last, and then I'll put you out of your misery, Becky. It won't hurt, I promise. I've had my fun for the moment. He sat down opposite Richard, watching. You need help, Dante. You're not well. Let me help you. It was pathetic. It was desperate. But Becky was out of ideas and time. I'm not well. Dante laughed. Look around this room, Becky. I'd say Richard wasn't well and you don't look too good yourself. But me? I'm just dandy. Suddenly he stood up. I've had enough. He picked up his knife, walked over to Richard's dangling body and slashed his throat. Becky screamed in horror as the little blood left in Richard's body oozed from the gash in his neck. Then Dante picked up a plastic bag. With 3 strides he was behind Becky and the bag was over her face. Becky felt the bag pull tight around her neck and his hands twisting the plastic into hard knots at the back of her head. She gasped in panic, and the plastic contoured to her face like an obscene second skin. She tried to drag in air that wasn't there. Her eyes felt as if they would burst out of her head, and everything went black.